Testing 1 2, testing 1 2 3, testing 1 2 3.
See? So that answers my question. Is this sturdy?
Yeah, don't hit it.
If you want to adjust this, is that good for you right there?
Well, I think what I'm a little concerned about is this sticking out. I may have just tested it for other people.
But make sure that everybody...
Thank you. Oh my goodness, I've got so many things to remember. How am I going to do it? I'm going to move this just a pinch back so it's out of the... I'm a little worried. Do you have another piece of tape or two? Just trying to move it out of the pathway. I don't think I'm the first person. I welcome you, we welcome you to this program entitled Making Sense of Post-Cult Trauma and the Relational System of the Traumatizing Narcissist. Now that's a mouthful, but you'll get a lot of information as the day goes on. We're very pleased that you've joined us because this is the first collaboration between the International Cultic Studies Association, ICSA, and NIP, or the National Institute for the Psychotherapies. And they have been generous in providing this place for us to meet today. ICSA, founded in 1979, has the mission to apply research and professional perspectives on cultic groups to educate the public and to help those who have been harmed. I urge you to visit the website for further information on this, and we'll talk a little bit more about it at the end. NIP offers affordable, high-quality, and in-depth psychoanalysis, couples therapy, psychological testing, and other services offered by over 70 skilled therapists and available to, in a variety of treatment orientations. I'm Chris Carlson. I'm currently a hospital-based licensed clinical social worker. Regarding this topic, I co-facilitate a monthly meeting sponsored by ICSA, which is open to the public. It's here in New York, the last Friday of every month, with Dan Shaw, who is one of the presenters today. Having been involved in a group which I consider a cult, then leaving it, I have done extensive educational outreach on this topic over the last 25 years. The term cult may conjure strong images for some of you. Extremism, suicide, mass weddings. It may also elicit judgmental attitudes towards those involved, in particular, the members of these groups. After all, how could we not wonder why these people would allow themselves to get caught up in something like that? And of course, this is what we face anytime we discuss this in a public setting, or our friends or our family members who aren't familiar with this wonder what is going on with this topic. One of the comments shared among the many who have gone through such an experience and then come out of it is, and this is important in understanding this phenomenon, none of us went looking to sign up for a cult. None of us went looking for an environment that would interfere severely with our free will. We didn't sign up to fundraise 20 hours a week, 7 days a week. So something else happened, and that's what we're hoping to look into a little more today. The groups or individuals involved in these groups don't explain what's going to happen to the newcomers. The newcomer enters an unfamiliar, multi-dimensional experience, which is orchestrated to lead to a subjugation of free will to undue influence. Now, in my first draft, I put sublimation in there, and fortunately, Dan caught it. And I know in this crowd, you might think, well, it was just an accident. No, probably not. But anyway, subjugation is the more accurate. And then, of course, there are those who are raised in groups like we are going to discuss today. Raised in this extreme environment under extreme circumstances. And when they leave a group like this, they have a particular recovery process, which takes a great deal of training and sensitivity. Because they bring with them, as well as the other people who leave these groups, a long list of abuses and exploitations, and maybe things worse. One of the common stories we also hear from people who leave these groups and have sought help from mental health professionals is that they face a striking lack of understanding in these professions about the dynamic process under discussion today. That the mental health profession overall has not yet been oriented to address the complex relational dynamics found in cults or high-demand groups and their potential for inducing trauma. We hope that this presentation will be part of furthering the awareness of the unique features found in these environments, which have affected many thousands, their families, their friends, and the communities they live in. We're going to start with two personal stories to get you involved. The first speaker will be William Yenner. He was first introduced to meditation in Rishikesh, India, in the 1970s, and was later a committed practitioner of Buddhist Vipassana meditation. His involvement with Andrew Cohen and Cohen's Enlighten Next community spanned 13 years, and it is about this involvement that he will speak today. His story is typical of so many who have been students of Cohen's. At the outset, it was characterized by idealism, inspiration, and in the middle, devotion and hard work helped build the organization. And in the end, he was left disillusioned, and disappointed after a series of debilitating and abusive experiences. He has since written a book, American Guru, on his experiences. He'll talk about that as well. The other speaker this morning is Anne Stamler. She has degrees in Latin and a master's in Latin, and after leaving the group she was involved in since birth, Aesthetic Realism, was the associate director of a national Jewish nonprofit agency in New York, and later helped found a private school in Connecticut. She's currently a representative for her town meeting in Fairfield, Connecticut, and works with ICSA with the second generation victims, meaning folks who were raised in groups and have left them. They're referred to as SGAs for short. And earlier this year, she became an associate editor for ICSA Today, which is one of the publications that ICSA produces. Mr. Yenner will start us today.
Good morning.
Good morning.
The beginning. On a snowy night in 1988 in Amherst, Massachusetts, an old friend told me a remarkable story. H.W.L. Punja, a mystic sage in India, had transformed a young Westerner in a matter of weeks into a powerful guru who he had charged with inspiring a revolution among the young. The Westerner's name was Andrew Cohen. Within a few days, I hurried to attend my first of countless of Andrew's teachings or satsangs. That evening, Andrew sat in front of the room, eyes closed. Eventually, he opened his eyes and said, "Does anyone have any questions?" Many people did. What is the true nature of freedom? What are the obstacles to achieving it? I was struck by Andrew's serenity. He spoke broadly about spiritual freedom and urged us to abandon the notion that we are not free. His talk cast a spell, and I felt connected to my passionate desire to attain freedom. I returned nightly, sensing a mystery that defied expression or comprehension. My own exchanges with Andrew fed my deep yearning for freedom, which had been the object of my many years of spiritual practice. Andrew wove the non-duality teachings of Indian Advaita Vedanta into his discourses. I became more convinced that I could attain the highest possible spiritual goal, enlightenment. Inevitably, my gravitation toward Andrew strained my marriage, which soon broke down, and I moved into one of Andrew's group houses and embarked on what was to be a 13-year career as a devotee. From that moment forward, my life and Andrew's, His teachings, wishes, and priorities were profoundly intertwined. Heading west, within months, Andrew moved his community to California, where the closeness and trust between community members grew. He founded Enlighten Next magazine and increasingly relied on his students for unremunerated, creative, and managerial support. Andrew instituted weekly gender-segregated meetings where members could investigate the teachings. These meetings gradually took another purpose, a targeted criticism of a fellow student, ostensibly to free that student from the influence of the ego. Such meetings could become grueling affairs if an individual did not humbly and sincerely embrace the offered criticism. They were subjected to protracted attacks on their character by other students. On one occasion, I was the focus of one such session, having been accused of undermining a fellow student. I became frightened and defensive, and I was subjected to several hours of intense and escalating pressure intended to humble me. The day after my ordeal, which had concluded at 3 a.m., I received a directive from Andrew to shave my head. This was Andrew's remedy for pride or vanity, and it was typically prescribed for a year at a time. Often, however, received offense, a display of pride or aggressive behavior, for example, result in a renewal of vows, another year with a shaved head. My vows were extended in this fashion 3 times. Though vaguely aware of a creeping authoritarianism in Andrew's approach, I still felt trustful of his motivations, and I still considered the balance of things to be tipped totally in his favor. Finding Fox Hollow. In 1994, Andrew put me in charge of the search for a home, or ashram, for his growing community. Eventually, the search turned to the East Coast, where a 220-acre property was found in Lenox, Massachusetts. At close to $3 million, the property, known as Fox Hollow, required far more funds than were available. Andrew was counting on the largesse of a wealthy student, Jane O'Neill, who had offered a loan toward the property. Instead, Andrew now asked Jane to consider donating the money. Andrew charged the senior student, who was one of Jane's closest friends, with bringing her around to donating rather than lending the money. Jane was gradually persuaded to finance the purchase with a stipulation that the donation be kept strictly confidential to keep her family from finding out, and Andrew agreed. Within a few months, the property was officially ours. I have a photo of a beaming Jane O'Neill and me standing together in front of Fox Hollow. Seeing that photo now, I cringe at the memory of how Jane was manipulated while I silently stood by. Within 2 years, Jane had left the community. Days after Jane's departure, an angry Andrew Cohen publicly revealed that she had been the donor who made Fox Hollow possible. Soon we began restoration of the Manor house, the largest of about a dozen buildings. It was one of the happiest times of my career. I became Fox Hollow's business manager and a member of its board of directors. I also lived in Andrew's house, the only student other than his wife who shared that privilege. At Fox Hollow, the number of practices, meetings, and projects began to multiply. Andrew spoke about an absolute relationship to life as a feature of the enlightened condition, and as his students, we were committed to the cultivation of an all-hands-on-deck attitude. Nearly a decade had passed since meeting Andrew Cohen. Fox Hollow was my home, my fellow students were my family, and Andrew was my spiritual mentor. Yet not everything was as it seemed. In addition to new rules and practices that seemed to contradict some of Andrew's earlier teachings, money began to have a growing influence on day-to-day life. To help finance Fox Hollow, Andrew instituted an entrance fee of $1,000 per formal student for each year of prior participation. This fee entitled a student to participate at Fox Hollow. Thus, with the gradual imposition of rules, taxes, and spirit-breaking confrontational meetings, the climate in Andrew's community had changed significantly, and I began to witness transformations in Andrew's personality, methods, and teachings that would take me years to fully comprehend. But in 1997, with a gleaming new facility, a growing community, and my own personal sense of accomplishment, Fox Hollow was still where I wanted to be. At that point, I could not see the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The dark side of enlightenment. Some of the changes in our new environment were subtle, such as the institution of a daily exercise regime, and some, while they were closely guarded secrets occurring only behind closed doors, were not subtle at all, such as punishment in the form of physical abuse. These changes were indicative of the power that Andrew Cohen sought to exert on his followers' lives. They were also harbingers of even more egregious abuses to come. As Andrew's influence over us grew, he became more controlling of our sexual and romantic lives. As a long-term member, I could only seek companionship among the few women who had proven themselves through years of devotion and service to Andrew. One could not seek a partner outside the community, and there were no casual sexual encounters. As a result, I spent all but 6 months of my 13 years with Andrew without a romantic partner. When one did manage to obtain permission for a relationship, Andrew often intervened to end it. In my case, he decided that my relationship should end because my partner had been proud. In other words, like all relationships inside the community, mine began with his consent and ended by his decree. Along with new rules and regulations, Andrew also began instituting punishments as well. The methods were often random, harsh, out of proportion to the alleged wrong, and questionable as educational skillful means. Andrew referred to his new system as acts of outrageous integrity, and it consisted of extreme teaching methods designed to cut through the student's ego and resistance in order to facilitate awakening. Cohen's acts of outrageous integrity included disciplinary face slapping, in which it was difficult to discern any particular lesson other than shape up. In some cases, Andrew would direct one student to slap another. In others, he administered the slaps himself. For some time, Cohen had been bestowing ironic spiritual names intended to make their bearers acutely aware of their character flaws. There were Mad Dog and Raging Bull, who had tempers, Nar, who was a narcissist, Cash, who was casual, Integrity, who supposedly lacked it, and many others. Thus, an unprecedented degree of control eventually came to pervade the atmosphere of the Fox Hollow community, and groupthink was certainly one of the consequences. It is a well-known and troubling fact that group mentality has the potential to override individual morality. I experienced this firsthand as a member of Andrew's community, observing, participating in, rationalizing, and excusing at times extremely harsh treatment of fellow members who had angered their teacher. When a student was slapped or evicted from a student household, for example, I told myself that it was for that individual's own good, chalking it up to my teacher's passionate determination to free him or her from the tyranny. I do not regard the fact that there was no forum in which to question such behavior as an excuse for my failure to have done so. Even when later on I found myself on the receiving end of abusive treatment, I compartmentalized those experiences in my own mind, suspending judgment and my own humanity in an effort to adhere to the party line. Another incident involved a student, Michaela, who had fallen out of favor by reminding Cohen that something he criticized her for doing had been his idea in the first place. He decried her as evil and ordered that the walls, floor, and ceiling of her office, which had been relocated to an unfinished basement room, be painted red to signify the spilled blood of her guru. She was ordered to spend hours there contemplating the implications of her transgression, with the additional aid of a large cartoon on the wall depicting her as a vampire and the word traitor written in large letters next to it. Andrew often employed red paint in this fashion to create environments designed to induce shame and guilt in students that he felt had questioned his judgment or disobeyed him. Another female student who had displeased Andrew and after leaving the community had returned to help out on a weekend project was summoned to another basement room. There she was met by 4 female students who, having guided her onto a plastic sheet on the floor, each poured a bucket of paint over her head as a message of gratitude from Andrew. She left the property traumatized and fell ill in subsequent days, during which she was harassed by phone calls from another student who, at Cohen's instigation, repeatedly called her a coward and never again returned to Fox Hollow. A final word on crazy wisdom. Many of us who have left the community have often discussed among ourselves our complicity in the execution of acts of outrageous integrity that essentially amounted to abuse, and whether we witnessed these abuses firsthand or from a distance, we have often expressed regret over our failure to intervene or to acknowledge our part in the harm they brought to so many individuals. Thus, while Andrew Cohen's acts of outrageous integrity became a common fixture in our community, redemption rarely, if ever, followed, and it was gradually becoming apparent that the guru's renewed good graces came at an entirely different sort of price. This new currency of forgiveness was cold, hard cash. The currency of forgiveness. The practice of donating money to atone for mistakes had begun in California in the mid-90s, and at that time had been accepted by all and never questioned. What I witnessed at Fox Hollow, and what others have also reported, are clear indication of Cohen's recognition that he was going to have to venture beyond a purely voluntary basis for the collection of donations if his organization was to thrive. Money, not spirit, was the new coin of the realm. Andrew let it be understood that his good favor could be had for a price. It is a testament to the faith that so many of us had in Andrew that, despite the questionable nature of these new financial arrangements, we complied, some of us taking on enormous and ill-advised borrowing. Here are two brief summaries of financial exploitation. Student A stated that as a result of doing poorly in his teacher's eyes and feeling under great pressure to do more for Enlighten Next, he offered a check of $3,000 to Cohen as a sign of his remorse. Cohen stormed into the student's room, threw the check on the floor, and demanded angrily, "Do you think you can buy me off for a lousy $3,000? Having previously heard Cohen say that any long-term student who blows it will owe $20,000 in karmic retribution, this student scraped together what he had and borrowed the rest to present the expected amount. This student, after leaving Enlighten Next, asked for his donation back, which was declined. Student B related how she ran away from Fox Hollow, but was found and brought back by another student. She wasn't allowed to live in Fox Hollow, however, but off campus with other women who were deemed to be doing poorly. In the meantime, she was told how she had made a terrible mistake in trying to leave, and to make her way back, she had to give everything. Gradually, she came to understand that this was meant to specifically include giving her $60,000 IRA, and after a time, she did turn it over to Enlighten Next. But she was told again that everything means everything, which led her to offer any future inheritance from her family. Subsequently, she was allowed to return to Fox Hollow. Shortly thereafter, she left Enlighten Next prior to receiving an inheritance. As I will recount in more detail later, I also had the experience of buying forgiveness when I gave Andrew Cohen an inheritance I had recently received from my father's estate. My fall from grace. By mid-1999, I was beginning to wake up to the reality of the life I was living. That summer, I rankled Andrew with my failure to congratulate him for a recently published book, and I had also organized a 5-day holiday for myself and 4 other students, something that was rarely done. Vacations were normally done in conjunction with work for Andrew, such as setting up a retreat. This one had no purpose other than going away for a while. My new expression of independence didn't sit well with Andrew. Then, after a retreat in France, Andrew casually revealed to a group of 4 close male students a deeply personal story that I had told him in confidence. Andrew frequently revealed information shared with him in confidence, particularly delicate information of a sexual nature. I was mortified when he revealed that I had twice in my life paid for sex. I was forced to admit to what I had done during my vacation some 20 years prior. But my embarrassed admission was not the end of it. I was urged to elaborate on the experience and then was accused of being too revealing. Next, Andrew convened several meetings of these 4 male students with me on the subject of my sexuality. Men I considered my brothers shouted in my face and abused me verbally. Later, a fellow student slapped me in the face. She didn't have to tell me that the blow was from Andrew. Around the world in 100 days. I was then ordered to go to London, where I felt disoriented when stripped of my responsibilities. I behaved like a jilted lover, pouting, raging, and sending expensive bouquets with letters of apology to Andrew. When another community member, likely at Andrew's insistence, slapped me in the face, I thanked him, despite the anger I struggled to conceal. As my situation and state of mind deteriorated, I decided to offer to Andrew the last remnant of my self-worth, that is to say, all my money. In the twisted reality in which I found myself, I considered this my last best option. I did not think leave this community. I told him I wanted to surrender all that I had. What I wanted to give up was my $80,000 inheritance. I heard nothing immediately from Andrew about accepting this offer. Weeks later, I received instructions that I was to move again, this time to Australia, to join another penitent there. My crime, betraying Andrew and his teachings. Then, just 6 days after arriving there, Andrew ordered my return to Cambridge, where I was ordered to move into a student house, sharing a room with 3 other men. Soon word came from Andrew's office at Fox Hollow to send the $80,000 that I had pledged. Despite my regret, I sent it in. Not long after I sent Andrew the money, I learned that a colleague of mine had fled the London community and was in Rotterdam. Because the atmosphere of fear and intimidation in Andrew's communities, students often left surreptitiously. I was given the task to retrieve the escapee. In Rotterdam, I did locate him, but I had no luck convincing him to return. However, now my lot seemed better, and I returned to Fox Hollow on somewhat better footing. Though no longer a leader, I jumped back into work and life at Fox Hollow, beginning each day at 3 a.m. with a 3-hour practice of 1,000 prostrations before a photograph of Andrew. I didn't gain insight into why I had so precipitously fallen out of favor. Was the recent positive turn of my experience of community life for real? I wasn't sure. One day, Andrew asked me to search for a new property for his London center. I quickly moved to London, and over the next several months, I found an appropriate property and helped to arrange for its purchase. Then, as if with a flick of a switch, I was evicted from my quarters in a student house, and soon thereafter was told to return to Massachusetts to live with 2 other fallen male students. I was now running on empty, exhausted. The 3 of us outcasts made futile attempts to win Andrew's forgiveness. Some days later, I was told once again that I was no longer welcome at Fox Hollow. I felt nothing, not yet, not even relief. I decided to leave the community for good. In the immediate days of my new life outside Enlightened Next, I was aware that something very important was happening. I began to feel joy and liberation. I'd anticipated that I might feel overcome with guilt or shame, but instead I felt gratitude to myself. I was back. My life was mine again. Autonomy, individuality, freedom were once again mine. Words of Nietzsche come to mind. At long last, the person appears free to us again. The sea, our sea, lies open again. Perhaps there has never been such an open sea. Life after Andrew. Leaving the Enlightened Next cult has been one of the most powerful and positive experiences of my life. The sheer emptiness I felt was actually a balm to my soul, and as the first hours and days passed, I began to experience a sense of boundless freedom and joy. The relief I felt at having escaped Andrew's grip propelled me into a nearly constant state of bliss. The recovery of one's autonomy is the sweetest thing. I also had my inner work cut out for me. I still had many deeply ingrained Andrew-centric ideas to purge. Approximately 2 years after I'd left in early 2003, I heard from two fellow former students who had each recently been invited by Andrew for a sit-down, meaning a meeting, and both reported that he had spoken negatively of his former students, referring to us as the Shadow Sangha. He had encouraged both of these former students to withdraw their commitments to attend an upcoming reunion of former students that was being planned in Costa Rica. Hearing this left me angry and determined not to allow my newfound freedom to waver in any way. My growing sense of autonomy now made it possible for me, for the first time, to begin holding Andrew accountable for his actions. I decided that I must confront Andrew. In a letter to him, I said that it was outrageous that he would have anything other than kind words for those of us who had given years of our lives to his loyal service, and declared that in my view his solicitation of my inheritance had been made under duress, which we both knew to be unethical, and demanded its return. Within a couple of days I received a call from Andrew offering to return my money if I didn't want to donate it, he didn't want to keep it. When the paperwork for the return of the donation arrived, however, there was a string attached, a 5-year gag order restricting me from making public statements about Andrew. The gag order seemed to contradict everything that Andrew had ever stood for, but I signed the papers and I took my donation back. It was an unprecedented triumph for a former student, yet only the beginning for me. I still had a lot left to process about my 13 years of discipleship. I feel in retrospect that it was beneficial to have been forced to ruminate so quietly for so long. By the summer of 2008, when my gag order expired, I was well into writing American Guru, which was published the following year. Since the publications of American Guru and other revelations of abuse online at the What Enlightenment blog, there has been an attempt by Cohen to moderate his public persona as a rude guru. Last year, his harsh denunciation of students in his 2006 essay, A Declaration of Integrity, was quietly removed from his blog, though it was returned months later after this was publicly published. Over the same period, he has revised his formerly harsh appraisal of his former teacher, now replacing that with words of love and appreciation. Reportedly, a PR consultant hired by Cohen advised him to improve his outreach or risk deterioration of financial support. The lessons of the Enlightenment story have yet to be learned in their entirety. Though I wish neither ill nor harm to Cohen's current followers, it is my opinion that membership in his community represents an invitation to waste one's time and energy, and possibly one's entire life, in the service of a destructive and damaging myth, as well as a dubious opportunity to entangle oneself ever more deeply and dangerously in its creator's elaborately constructed lies. Those of us who have left the Enlightenment community did so for what have turned out to be compellingly good reasons. No teacher worthy of the name would subject his students to the kinds of mental, physical, and financial abuses described here, and no spiritual leader who requires his followers to internalize and reinforce a fantasy of his own perfection deserves a platform for his hypocritical ideology of evolutionary enlightenment. Even with the adversity they have brought to my life, I have benefited from the years I spent with Andrew Cohen. 20 years ago, a younger man left it all to join in Andrew's holy life. What looks naive today was totally compelling then. From this realization springs compassion for all who have participated. Even now, I choose not to renounce my years of devotion. I experienced the freedom of letting go and learned about the deeper meaning of my existence. I wouldn't be who I am today without all of it, positive and negative, and regret would take away the gratitude I have for being courageous enough to take the initial leap and wise enough to know when to call it quits. I do, however, feel responsible for hurting others through my complicity in Cohen's excesses. I hope the presentation here can spare others from making the same mistakes.
Good morning. Aesthetic realism revolved around its founder, Eli Siegel, who was born in Latvia in 1902 and immigrated to America with his family. Siegel stirred controversy in the literary world in the 1920s with a poem some called a masterpiece, others illiterate nonsense, and with essays on socialism, evolution, art, and mental health. My father, an artist, began studying poetry with Siegel in 1941. My mother, also an artist, by 1943. In his Greenwich Village studio at that time, Siegel was teaching mostly artists and writers what he thought made art successful and how art could help people in their lives. He called his teaching aesthetic analysis, countering, as he saw it, the dominantly Freudian psychoanalysis of that era. Later, he renamed his teaching the philosophy of aesthetic realism, which he continued to teach in that same Greenwich Village studio until he took his life in 1978. My mother founded an art gallery in the village in the mid-1950s to promote Siegel's philosophy, and later helped start the Aesthetic Realism Foundation. My parents and I were among the first people Siegel authorized to teach his philosophy. I finally left the movement in 1985 when I was 41 years old. My father remained until his death at age 89, 3 years ago. My mother is still there at age 92. The philosophy as I learned it growing up and as it is described today on the group's website is based on 3 principles. 1, the deepest desire of every person is to like the world on an honest or accurate basis. 2, the greatest danger for a person is to have contempt for the world. And 3, all beauty is the making one of opposites, and the making one of opposites is what we are going after in ourselves. On its surface, aesthetic realism appears benign. Its teachings are humanistic, reflecting Siegel's wide knowledge. For years after I left the movement, I thought if only Siegel's teachings were freed from the possessive adoration of his followers, aesthetic realism might be recognized as useful knowledge. I no longer believe the philosophy is benign. There is a fundamentalism, a black-white thinking in aesthetic realism that promotes distortion. I believe the seeds of cultic behavior are in the philosophy, and I believe that Siegel used his philosophy to serve a consuming need to be praised. My purpose today is twofold. First, to describe how elements of this environment impacted my life, and second, to explain how I was finally impelled to break free. I am not familiar with the group's current functioning. However, during the years I was there, aesthetic realism was an outwardly benign, culturally dressed group that inwardly could mangle people's minds. I hope my story will help others better understand people who have been victims of mentally abusive movements, especially those who, like me, were born and raised in them. My early experience. The day I was born, my father was on a troop carrier off the coast of Normandy. My mother was living in a loft in Greenwich Village. While I was still an infant, my mother would bring me with her to sessions with Siegel. When my father returned from Europe, I'm told, he visited Siegel before coming home to see my mother and meet me. From my earliest years, Siegel was a dominant force in my family. My parents would take me out of nursery school to go to sessions. When they fought, they would call Siegel on the telephone to mediate. He advised them on their families, jobs, money, me, where to live, their friends, their dreams, literally, and their fears. We lived on the Upper East Side and then in Brooklyn with other adults who studied with Siegel. There were study groups in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. There were a few other young children, but I was the first and for years the only one born into the movement. 3 of us from that time remained until adulthood. The other 2 are still there. Siegel was a constant source of dissension with my parents' families, who did not share their opinion of Siegel. We grew more and more distant from my parents' relatives, and by the time I was an adolescent, had nothing to do with them at all. When my mother's father was dying of cancer, she refused to visit him, and she did not attend his funeral. Siegel praised her for this, calling it the new kindness. From my earliest years, Siegel seemed to me 2 different people. One was charming, warm, and often quite funny. He talked as if he expected me to understand, and he criticized my parents when he felt they did not respect or understand me. Other times, he became angry to the point of rage because he believed his students were not sufficiently grateful for the good he was doing our lives and not doing enough to tell other people about him. He believed he represented beauty and ethics, and so our attitude to him was our attitude to beauty. He believed I grew up believing Siegel's explanation that whatever problem I had in life, at school, with friends, the reason was that I did not like myself because I was ungrateful to him.